Keanu has behaved in a way no one expected. The interviewer today was trying to break Keanu apart. But when the tricky question came off his lips, Keanu surprised everyone. The lights of the studio beamed down on the sleek black chairs positioned at the center of the stage. The audience murmured with anticipation, their excitement buzzing through the air like static electricity. Tonight's guest was none other than Keanu Reeves, beloved actor and a symbol of humility in Hollywood. But the man sitting across from him, John Smith, had a reputation for something else entirely: provocation. Smith leaned forward, shuffling his note cards with a smirk. His show thrived on conflict, on making his guests uncomfortable, and tonight, he had his sights set on Reeves. Keanu, dressed in a simple black blazer over a dark shirt, adjusted his seat and let out a slow breath. His silver cross glinted under the stage lights, resting against his chest. He had worn it for years, but tonight, it was about to become the center of the discussion. Smith smiled, his voice sharp. Keanu, you've always been known as one of the most grounded celebrities in Hollywood. But let's talk about that cross around your neck. He gestured toward the pendant, his smirk widening. You wear it often, don't you? Keanu nodded slightly. Yeah. Smith's smile twisted. Faith is an interesting thing. Some would say an outdated thing. A relic of a world that has long since evolved beyond needing it. Wars have been fought in its name. People have been divided because of it. And yet, here you are, a man of intelligence, still clinging to it. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss tomorrow's video. Keanu didn't flinch. He took a moment, his fingers brushing over the cross before he looked up at Smith. There was no anger in his gaze, no defensiveness, only calm. I don't think faith is about clinging to something outdated, Keanu said, his voice smooth and measured. I think faith is about finding meaning, about searching for freedom in something bigger than ourselves, and about love. A hush fell over the room. Even Smith's smirk faltered for a second. Love, he echoed. That's an interesting way to put it. Keanu nodded. Anything can be used to divide people, ideologies, science, politics, even money. But that's not the fault of faith itself. It's about how people choose to use it. John Smith tilted his head, his smirk returning. He had expected a defensive response, maybe even frustration. Instead, Keanu had met his challenge with poise. That wasn't what Smith wanted. He wanted controversy, something he could dissect and twist. So, you're telling me, Smith began, tapping his pen against his notes, that faith, something that has been used to justify oppression, war, and control, can also be about freedom? That's a bit contradictory, don't you think? Keanu leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees. It depends on how you look at it. Oh, please, Smith scoffed. Let's not get philosophical. Religion has dictated laws, crushed scientific progress, and divided nations. How exactly do you reconcile that with love and freedom? Keanu took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. He wasn't here to argue, only to speak the truth as he saw it. Think about a knife, he said simply. Smith blinked. A knife? Keanu nodded. A knife can be used to prepare food, to carve something beautiful, to save a life in surgery. But it can also be used to harm, to take life. The knife itself isn't the problem. It's how people use it. The audience murmured. Some nodded in understanding, others exchanged glances. Smith narrowed his eyes. So you're saying faith is just a tool? Keanu shrugged. It can be. Like science. Science has given us medicine, technology, ways to improve life. But it's also given us nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and AI that some people fear will replace us. He paused, letting his words settle in. Does that mean science is bad? Or does it mean people have a responsibility in how they use it? Smith opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. He hadn't expected this. He was used to celebrities getting flustered, stumbling over their words. But Keanu was different, calm, centered, completely unshaken. Keanu continued, his voice steady. Faith, at its best, gives people hope. It helps them find peace in chaos, purpose in struggle. Just because some people use it to control others doesn't mean that's what it was meant for. The audience sat in silence, absorbing Keanu's words. John Smith, usually the master of control in his interviews, drummed his fingers on his cue cards, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. He wasn't used to guests who could calmly dismantle his arguments without anger or arrogance. All right, Smith said, forcing a chuckle. Let's say I accept your knife analogy. But here's the problem, faith isn't just a personal tool, is it? It's been institutionalized. It's been forced onto people for centuries, used as a means of control. Science doesn't demand worship. Faith does. Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering Smith's words. His fingers brushed against the silver cross at his chest before he spoke. Faith doesn't demand worship, he said, his voice steady. People do. The audience stirred, intrigued. Keanu continued, institutions can twist anything faith, science, even government, to serve their own interests. That's not a flaw in faith itself. That's a flaw in human nature. Smith leaned forward, sensing a weak point. So you admit that religion has been a source of oppression? Keanu nodded. Of course. But so has nearly every other human institution. Science was used to justify eugenics. Governments have committed genocide. Even money, the thing people rely on every day, has been the cause of corruption, suffering, and war. Smith opened his mouth but stopped short. Keanu's words hung in the air, undeniable. So the question, Keanu said softly, looking directly at Smith, isn't whether faith is good or bad. The question is whether people are willing to take responsibility for how they use it. Smith exhaled, tapping his cards against the desk. He was losing the audience, and he knew it. Time to pivot. Well, that's a nice sentiment, Smith said, a smirk creeping back onto his face. But let's talk reality, Keanu. You're an actor, a man of logic, of discipline, of skill. You train for roles, you study, you prepare. Doesn't it seem strange to believe in something you can't prove? Keanu smiled, leaning back in his chair. John, do you love anyone? The question caught Smith off guard. His smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. Of course. Can you prove it? Keanu asked, raising an eyebrow. Smith blinked. What? Can you prove love? Keanu repeated, his tone gentle but firm. Can you measure it? Weigh it? Put it in a test tube? Smith scoffed. That's different. Keanu shrugged. Is it? The audience murmured again. Some were nodding, others whispering to one another. Smith's confident expression wavered just slightly. Not everything we believe in can be measured, Keanu continued. Not love. Not hope. Not courage. But we know they exist because we feel them, because they change us, because they shape the world around us. Smith's smirk was gone. He had expected an easy fight. Instead, Keanu was making him, and everyone watching, think. And that was more powerful than any argument. John Smith shifted in his chair, trying to mask his discomfort. He wasn't used to losing control of a conversation, and Keanu had just turned the argument in an unexpected direction. The audience was no longer laughing at Smith's jabs. They were leaning in, captivated by Keanu's calm wisdom. Still, Smith wasn't ready to concede. All right, he said, exhaling sharply. You're comparing faith to love, to things we feel but can't quantify. Fine. But there's a difference, Keanu. Love isn't tied to dogma. Love doesn't come with rules, with ancient texts telling you how to live your life. Science evolves, faith doesn't. Keanu took a moment before responding, his expression thoughtful. I think you're underestimating faith. Smith raised an eyebrow. Oh, how so? Keanu leaned forward slightly. Faith isn't static. It evolves just like everything else. People grow, perspectives shift, understanding deepens. The way we practice faith today is different from 100 years ago, just like science today is different from 100 years ago. Smith frowned. Science is based on evidence. It's about progress, about questioning and refining ideas. Faith is about believing without proof. Keanu nodded. And yet, even science begins with belief. A scientist has to believe a question is worth asking before they search for an answer. They have to believe there's something to discover before they conduct an experiment. Smith opened his mouth but hesitated. Keanu continued, think about quantum physics. There are things we now accept as reality, particles existing in multiple places at once, the concept of entanglement, that would have sounded like fantasy a century ago. Science didn't abandon them just because they weren't immediately provable. It explored them. It kept questioning. Faith is the same way, Keanu said. It's not just about following rules. It's about exploring meaning, about understanding something greater than ourselves. Just like science seeks to understand the universe, faith seeks to understand the soul. Smith chuckled, shaking his head. So now you're saying faith and science are the same thing? Keanu smiled. I'm saying they don't have to be enemies. They're just two different ways of searching for truth. The applause rippled through the studio, a rare moment on John Smith's show. Usually, his audience cheered for his sharp jabs, for the way he backed his guests into corners. But tonight, they were responding to something different, Keanu's sincerity, his quiet wisdom. Smith noticed. His smirk tightened. He wasn't about to lose control of the conversation completely. All right, Keanu, Smith said, raising his hand slightly. as if conceding a small point. Let's say I agree that faith and science are both ways of searching for truth. But here's my problem. Science adapts to new discoveries. Faith clings to old ideas. If we had relied on faith alone, we'd still believe the earth is flat, that disease comes from curses instead of bacteria. Science moved us forward. Faith held us back. Keanu listened patiently, then nodded. You're right. Smith blinked. I am. Keanu smiled. Yes. Faith, when used as an excuse to stop questioning, can absolutely hold people back. Just like science, when used without ethics, can create destruction. But that's not a flaw in faith itself. It's a flaw in how people use it. Smith exhaled through his nose, trying to find a way back into control. So you admit faith has been used to stop progress? Keanu nodded. Of course. Just like science has been used to justify terrible things. Eugenics, nuclear warfare, chemical weapons. Progress isn't just about new discoveries, John. It's about wisdom. Knowing how to use what we learn. Keanu continued, his voice steady. Science asks, how does the universe work? Faith asks, why does the universe exist? They're different questions, but they both matter. Smith narrowed his eyes. And you think they can coexist? Keanu's expression softened. I think they have to. Smith glanced at his notes, as if searching for a rebuttal. But Keanu's words had shifted the conversation. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was something more profound. John Smith leaned back in his chair, pressing his lips together. He wasn't used to this. Usually, by this point in an interview, his guest was either defensive or flustered. But Keanu Reeves remained impossibly calm, his every answer disarming rather than provoking. Smith adjusted his tie, searching for an angle. He needed to steer the conversation back into his control. All right, Keanu, Smith said, tapping his pen on the desk. You're making faith sound poetic, even philosophical. But let's get real. Faith divides people. We see it in wars, in politics, in discrimination. Science doesn't do that. Keanu's gaze remained steady. Science doesn't divide people? Smith scoffed. No, it doesn't. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Then why do some people still argue about climate change? Why do some refuse vaccines? Why did people once use science to justify racial superiority? Smith opened his mouth, then hesitated. Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm. Science gives us knowledge, but people decide what to do with it. Just like faith. Smith exhaled sharply. But faith is based on belief, not evidence. Keanu nodded. So is love. So is hope. So is human dignity. He gestured to the audience. If a scientist invented a machine that could scan people's brains and tell them the exact chemical reactions that make them feel love, would that change how you feel about the people you love? The audience murmured. Some shook their heads. Others frowned, deep in thought. Smith leaned forward, sensing his last chance to challenge him. Keanu, you're an intelligent guy. You've spent your life in an industry that thrives on reason, on craft, on discipline. Be honest, have you ever doubted your faith? Keanu smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and wisdom. Of course. Smith blinked. That wasn't the answer he had expected. Keanu continued. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's part of it. Just like in science, just like in life. We question, we search, we struggle. But we don't stop. The studio was silent. Even Smith, for once, had nothing to say. Keanu leaned back in his chair, resting his hands together. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to keep searching, even when the answers aren't clear. The audience erupted in applause. Smith looked out at them, then back at Keanu. He had walked into this interview expecting to break his guest down. Instead, Keanu had built something up, something bigger than the debate itself. And for the first time, Smith realized he wasn't just hosting a show. He was part of a conversation. Smith cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Well, Keanu, I have to admit, you've given this a lot of thought. Keanu smiled. I try. Smith tapped his pen against his cue cards again, his mind racing for a way to regain control. He had one last shot, one final push before the interview slipped completely from his grasp. You've talked about faith being a search for meaning, Smith said, his tone measured. But what about science? Doesn't science offer meaning? Doesn't it explain the universe in a way that faith never could? Keanu nodded. Science explains the how. Faith explores the why. Smith frowned. What's the difference? Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but deliberate. Science can tell you how a star is born, how it burns, how it dies. But it won't tell you why looking up at the night sky makes you feel something. Keanu continued. Science can measure brain activity when we experience joy, but it can't explain why music moves us, why art stirs something in us, why we long for connection. He paused, letting the words settle. Faith isn't about ignoring science. It's about what we do with what science can't explain. Smith exhaled, rubbing his chin. He had built his career on skepticism, on challenging people until they broke. But Keanu wasn't breaking. In fact, something unexpected was happening. John Smith wasn't just debating anymore. He was listening. He glanced at the audience. Some were nodding, others deep in thought. He looked back at Keanu, who sat there with the same quiet, unwavering presence he had from the start. Maybe, just maybe, this conversation wasn't about winning at all. The air in the studio had shifted. What had started as a debate was now something more, a dialogue, an exchange of ideas without the usual hostility. John Smith, the master provocateur, found himself in unfamiliar territory. He wasn't dismantling his guest. He was engaging with him. He let out a slow breath. All right, Keanu, he said, rubbing his chin. I have to admit, you're making this difficult for me. Keanu chuckled lightly. That's not my intention. Smith smiled despite himself. I believe you. He glanced at his cue cards, the ones filled with pre-written jabs and counterarguments. But for the first time, they felt useless. Keanu wasn't playing the game the way Smith had expected. He tossed the cards onto the desk with a sigh. Let me ask you something, man to man. Do you ever wonder if you're wrong? Keanu's expression softened. All the time. The audience stirred. Smith raised an eyebrow. Really? Keanu nodded. Doubt is natural. It's part of being human. The more I learn, the more I realize how little I actually know. Smith studied him. So what keeps you believing? Keanu took a moment before answering. The moments that can't be explained, the kindness of a stranger, the way people find hope in impossible situations, the love we feel for each other despite everything. He gestured toward the audience. Every person here has experienced something they can't fully explain, something that makes them feel connected to something greater than themselves. Smith sat quietly for a moment, his usual smirk absent. And you think that's faith? Keanu shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe it's just part of being alive. The silence stretched between them. For once, John Smith didn't have a rebuttal. And the audience, who had come expecting a battle, found themselves watching something rare. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. You know, Keanu, I had this whole plan coming into today. I was going to push you, challenge you, maybe even embarrass you. Keanu smiled slightly. I figured. Smith smirked. But it wasn't the cocky expression he had worn at the start of the show. It was something more genuine. But you didn't fight back. You didn't get defensive. You didn't even try to win the argument. Keanu nodded. Because it's not about winning. Smith raised an eyebrow. Isn't it? Keanu shook his head. Debates are about proving someone wrong. Conversations are about understanding. The audience murmured in agreement. Some clapped quietly. Smith glanced down at the cue cards he had abandoned earlier, then at the camera, then back at Keanu. So, tell me, what do you want people to take away from this? Keanu took a deep breath, then spoke simply. That faith, science, love, reason, they aren't enemies. They're all just different ways of searching for truth. And maybe we'd all be better off if we stopped trying to prove each other wrong and started trying to understand each other instead. The audience erupted into applause. Smith let it ride out before shaking his head again, a small chuckle escaping his lips. Keanu Reeves, ladies and gentlemen, he said, almost in disbelief. I don't know what just happened, but I think I liked it. John Smith, usually the victor in these intellectual sparring matches, sat back in his chair, arms crossed, a contemplative smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't used to feeling outmatched, not like this. But for once, losing didn't feel like defeat. Smith gestured to the audience. And yet, somehow, you've managed to turn this whole thing into one of the most thought-provoking conversations I've ever had on this show. He exhaled, tapping his fingers on the desk. I don't say this often, but respect. Keanu gave a small nod. Thank you, John. Smith shook his head, still in disbelief. So what now? You just keep going through life, believing in things you can't prove. Keanu smiled. I think we all do in some way. We believe in love, in purpose, in each other. We don't always have all the answers, but that doesn't mean the search isn't worth it. Smith studied him for a moment, then turned to the camera. Well, folks, this has been not what I expected, he admitted with a chuckle. But maybe that's a good thing. He turned back to Keanu. I think you might be the only person to ever come on the show and leave me with more questions than answers. Keanu grinned. That's how you know it was a good conversation. The audience erupted into laughter and applause. As the cameras faded to black and the interview came to an end, something remarkable had happened. A conversation that had begun as a challenge had transformed into something deeper, an exploration of faith, science, and the human need for meaning. And for John Smith, a man who had made a career out of provoking others, this was a first. For once, he had been the one changed.